1 minute warning.
Yeah. Okay, we're about ready to start. So
Yeah.
you could be quiet.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to be.
We're about to be
live.
live on YouTube. Just a second.
1 minute warning.
Yeah.
He's here.
Oh, he's on.
Yeah.
He's on there.
So, Mr. Chair, we're ready to start if you were.
You got it. We'll call the meeting of the Planning Commission this June 8, 2022. If staff could call roll, please.
Ryan Pearson,
Here.
Paul Wegman,
Present.
Philip Combs,
Present.
Lynn Larson, absent at this time. Brian Parsons,
Here.
Robert Estrada,
Here.
Don Daniels.
Here.
You have quorum, Chair.
Great. Thank you. Before us, we have the minutes of June 1st, 2022. I'm looking for a motion.
Make a motion that we accept the minutes as written.
Mr. Wagaman made a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Mr. Pearson. Geez, I always get Pearsons. Okay, Mr. Pearson, a second. Do I have any comments, changes? Seeing none at this time, all in favor by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Abstentions? Hearing none, minutes passed as written. Do we have any changes to our agenda?
No, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. At this time, we'll open up the public comments. Anyone wishing to speak to fellow commissioners at this time on any subject, you're able to do so. And do we have anyone signed up or online?
We do not, Mr. Chair.
And seeing no one in our audience this evening, we'll close the public comment period. We do not have a public hearing, and we move right to unfinished business, tree preservation code changes. I think it's Ms. Courtney Burnell.
Yes, good evening. Good evening, Chair, Commissioners. Thank you for scheduling this special meeting to focus in on the tree preservation code. I'm sure that by now you've all seen the email that contained a couple of documents we'll be going over tonight. What I wanted to start with is kind of going through that 30-page document for what to pay attention to most closely to make it a little bit more digestible, recognizing that at first glance, it's pretty overwhelming, but hopefully going through it quickly you'll see how we'll be able to go through the entire document fairly quickly this evening. And I wanted just to draw your attention to the fact that we have actually already visited 6 of these 12 key issues. So tonight we'll be going over the remaining 6, and we also have an amendment that we made to a couple from last week based off of your feedback. So this document that came out yesterday specifying the red line options for all 12 key issues per your request last week is formatted to allow for you to be able to go into the primary grid, select any key issue. And what we did was we gave a summary and then we copied the existing code section. What you likely are going to want to pay the most attention to are the options which show those red line versions. Specifically, any text in red shows you where text is being inserted or removed from the existing code. The rest of this is largely here for reference. So as you go through and are looking at your matrix of options, we did the best to kind of summarize them very briefly in the matrix and then make it hopefully easy for you to go directly to the spot in the document where you'll be looking for that reference material. In addition to the red lines, we've also given a brief fiscal impact. We'll be discussing that for each of the key issues that we're introducing tonight. What I do want to say is that this document doesn't include specific staff recommendations. We will provide some of that as it comes through, but right now, staff has presented options based off of the ad hoc committee recommendations, as well as what we're seeing best practices throughout the region, just for your consideration. There are a couple of areas where we'll provide recommendations, but that goes to say that these aren't staff recommendations. We are open to feedback. We are open to suggestions. And the starting point was the ad hoc committee recommendations. So with that, just really quickly, I wanted to also go over the matrix that was provided. It's been provided in the packet as a PDF, and I also sent it yesterday as an Excel spreadsheet. For your use, it might be easier to use the Excel spreadsheet, though if you would prefer to print it off and scan it back in or bring it in hard copy, whatever works for you works for us. Here we have all 12, and I gave you a bonus because it seemed like you needed one, 13th issue to go ahead and give us some of your direct input following the meeting. So tonight we'll go through the 12 key issues. You can ask clarifying questions. If you would like for an additional option to be brought up to be considered, we can revise this matrix and send out a revised version after tonight's meeting. Or if there's a general consensus tonight that we don't like a certain option, we can strike it entirely. And again, send out a revised matrix. So as you're going through, it might be helpful to pull up the matrix just as we follow along so that you can see where these different key issues, what the options are that we've provided thus far. The NAs mean that at this time, we don't have another option for that category. So some of them only have 2 options. The first option is, of course, no change, which means that we keep the existing code as is for that section. And then we've given an other or write-in. You are also able to edit this. But what I have envisioned is that you'll be able to go to one section, go up to your little highlighter and highlight that in yellow or some color to designate your vote. Send that back to us via email, hopefully by Monday around noon, so that we have an opportunity to gather all of your comments and feedback and be able to present that to you at your next meeting on Wednesday. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who is joining us again this evening from Planet Geo. She's going to introduce each of the red lines, and then I'll come back and for the fiscal impacts. Again, we have already reviewed key issues 1 through 4, 8, and 9. 8 and 9, we have a small change that we'll share with you, and then we will start looking at key issues 5 through 7 and 10 through 12. So bouncing around a little bit on the document that you have today. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you, Alex. Go right ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm just working on sharing my screen now, making sure you can all see that.
Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Courtney. And just wanted to reiterate that we're hopeful that these red lines are thought-provoking and that they can generate discussion so that we can have a better idea of what makes sense for Lakewood. And of course, as the planning commissioners, your opinions and feedback are really pivotal to homing in on the solutions that are best for Lakewood. So on that note, based on the commission's discussion from last week, we revisited key issues 8 and 9 to adjust those numbers, and we're going to review those first. So you have key issue 8 is the exemption for or maximum tree removal on single family property. So as we go down to option 2, which was as recommended by the ad hoc committee, which again, just to reiterate what Courtney said before, some of the recommendations from the committee were very broad. And so we, as a consultant team and with our experience in the field, just found examples and key industry standards that we could use to support that guidance from the ad hoc committee. So this recommendation was the minimum number of shade trees required for single family properties. And so that would be the minimum tree canopy to maintain. And we had some other numbers in here last week, and we wanted to reflect that we changed this to say 1 to 10,000 square feet. I'll try to zoom in a bit more here for us. 1 to 10,000 square feet as the first threshold, so that aligns with the potential for a single family property residential exemption at 10,000 square feet, if that is something that the commission is considering. And then we reduced the minimum number of shade trees required to reflect more realistic numbers. And so you should all see that in the packet that you received. And I just wanted to also share a scenario that we worked out with some industry standard numbers that show the spread diameter and spread area for small, medium, and large trees. So what you have here is, if we're assuming that the tree is a large tree that should be maintained on the property, and these are numbers that are pulled from specifically a report for Western Washington and Oregon. So these numbers are very specific to your region, and it was a Forest Service report. So the height being 46 feet, spread diameter being 41 feet, that's a calculation of a canopy cover area of 1,320 square feet. So as we translate that to the recommendation that you find in that option in the code, we see that the tree canopy percentage that is being recommended is 13% for the first designation, and then all the way up to 20% here. And so everything in this region, in this span here, is around 20% canopy cover for a single family property. So we're hoping that this helps to illustrate a little bit more of how this translates, how, having 1, 3, 5, or 6 shade trees on the property, what that actually looks like as far as tree canopy percentage coverage.
Yes, Mr. Pearson.
Are we waiting to go to ask questions on each item? This is one of the items I did have some questions on.
You can go ahead and ask question now instead of trying to refer back.
Real quick, so what is when the small, medium, and large tree, what are the ranges on the DBH for those? Because I do like my gut feel, these numbers feel correct to me, but I do like the regulating it with the tree units. And so I just wanted to know how those compared to the tree units, and if that was like 30 tree units to have, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. We don't have the DBH estimates here. This is the report. I was just pulling it up to see if I had any DBH estimates in here, but this is assuming that the tree is at maturity, and many of these shade trees will be 20 to sometimes 30, 40 inches in diameter at maturity. So it can really depend. And so it depends on the species. So I'm not sure that I want to, I could follow up with more information on that, but I'm not sure I want to misspeak at this point.
Thanks.
Courtney?
Great, thank you.
This last Friday, we had a tree tour, and a member from Department of Fish and Wildlife joined in, and they were able to explain that DBH varies a lot, even in the placement where in the city, based off of soil conditions, weather. It's very difficult to determine at full maturity what a DBH will result in. There are averages for certain species, but there's a lot of variability. And so as we've done some research, we've seen a lot more concrete, measurements for height when they're talking about small, medium, and large. Now, for Gary Oaks, DBH is important, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on. But for many other trees in Western Washington, the same age of tree could have a very different DBH depending on the conditions that it's grown in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. And I do have a scenario for the other option, so we'll get to that next. Just to reiterate, we adjusted the numbers so that it was a bit more realistic for your region, and we changed this property square footage to be more appropriate for Lakewood as well. So that is for your consideration. And then for the tree units calculation, which was the example from Olympia, we kept this the same as last week. So we did not make changes to this. The minimum tree canopy to maintain on single family lots would be based on 30 tree units per acre of buildable area. And the example that I've drafted up here shows that if we have a Douglas fir at 24-inch diameter, a Norway maple at 22, and a red alder at 16, then we would have a total number of tree units at 16. So this was just an example. I just put a few trees on there, but again, DBH can range dramatically. And so you could have one tree that is a 30-inch tree, and then you would get 10 tree units for that tree. So you can see that it really can depend, and obviously it will change over time as well as the tree grows.
Great.
And so then if we just want to scoot right through to replacement, these numbers exactly the same again, just that we would have these as the minimum standards so that you would meet these standards at the time of replacement. And we did include on-site replacement for single family lots here. And then it is a separate set of designations for on-site replacement for all other property types. So that's just one designation to keep in mind. And we have a question.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Wegman.
Is there any thought to large shrubs that could substitute for trees? You see some rhododendrons. A rhododendron is almost an evergreen all year round, and they get pretty large. And or maybe if you had small ones, if you had multiples of those, could they give us the same numbers that you're trying to get for a canopy cover? The other thing on that is if you get tall trees, again, close to house, we're trying to put solar panels and those things on the roof. If we had lower ones, then those solar panels would be up where they can see the sun, and we'd have the shade and some of the value of the root system holding the ground together and those kind of things. Any thought to that?
Sure, yeah, just a couple comments on that. So typically what we see in different cities is that you would categorize your vegetation on your property as understory growth that you would see, low levels of vegetation, and then medium and high levels of vegetation that is understory. And then you would have understory trees, which would obviously be different than a bush or grasses, things like that. And those are designated as they don't grow to the same size. So they're more appropriate for different locations on your property than a shade tree would be. And so a shade tree does have a designation of being those larger trees that provide much more shade that you can still have other vegetation growing underneath it. And I am happy to share this resource with you, the tree planting guide for the Western Washington and Oregon, because it really does, it provides more information on right tree, right place, as far as, you would want to have your shade trees further away from the house, your understory trees closer to your house, maybe in the front yard, and then your lower vegetation under utility lines, and that there are appropriate places to plant trees for your solar potential as well.
Great. Okay, Mr. Wegman.
Yeah, I don't know how we work through this, but, having been in the military and have taken advantage of some VA loans over the years, VA on the loan things, they would come in and say, well, you got to have X number of plants around the house. And, when the house is first planted and they put little teeny plants in and they put them about a foot away from the foundation, and, those don't make sense. Could we, as we're doing this, is to try and help our citizens, is to, when they come in to put a building plan together, that we talk through some of the options as far as what kind of shrubs would fit on their lot, help them get through that, or even have a arborist available to say, okay, what are your thoughts to make this lot work well for you?
We don't currently do any type of design review, so landscaping review for single family residential lots. That would be a new service. there are some jurisdictions that offer planting recommendations. Native planting recommendations, for example, are plant lists that are preferred to be located in the city. But right now, we don't have any type of design review for single family residential. We do what you're referencing for commercial and industrial developments. And then for the arborist, that is certainly something that would be appropriate if we were to move forward with an urban forestry type program, and something that we've already began exploring options for as staff if the Planning Commission and City Council choose to take that direction.
And did you have your hand up to answer or to something else, Courtney?
No, it was to answer.
Okay, and someone else has a hand up?
I
Who's
think
that?
you can see them. I'm sorry, Mr. Estrada and
yeah,
also
Mr. Parsons. Okay, I see it. Mr. Parsons.
I was gonna say, Mr. Estrada had his hand up first. He can go ahead.
Oh.
I
Go ahead,
appreciate.
Mr. Estrada.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Alex, could you please explain to me the replacement process? I don't quite understand this 2-to-1 of total diameter inches. Yeah, explain that to me, please. How does that
Sure.
work?
Sure, absolutely. So if you have a tree that is, let's just say, a 10-inch diameter tree, and you remove that tree, then the replacement ratio would be that you have to plant trees two times that DBH. So you would have to plant a total of 20 inches of trees. And so you can get trees at 2-inch diameter and plant 10 of them. And that would be the equivalent.
Okay. Okay.
And that
understand.
is a requirement in our existing code. So the 2-to-1 ratio is what we use today.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Parsons.
Yeah, similar to Mr. Wegeman, say we have to remove a tree and there's no good spots to put it in the lot. And offsite replacement seems like the best way to go. How stringent, or what do we have to prove? Like, how hard is this for a homeowner to prove this? And is it overly burdensome on the homeowner to be able to say, I need to put these offsite when they go through that process?
And Courtney, would that be something that's existing in your code already that you want to refer to? I mean, typically it looks like the code states that it is up to the director.
Yeah, that's what I read. So that's where I wasn't quite clear. I just want to make sure, in thinking about changes to this, what that process might be. And maybe we haven't done it and that's part of this conversation, but I appreciate that.
Right now, we have, and we'll present it a little later on for when we get into permit process. We've proposed a simple form that a property owner would be able to fill out, really as a notification that says the total number of trees on their lot, the number that they're planning to remove. We will, in theory, have the GIS to be able to compare, and then it would be issued, quote unquote, over the counter. For all scenarios, except for when it's either a special species like the Gary Oak or industrial or commercial lands. And in those cases, we would probably rely largely on the existing permitting process that we have for those types of scenarios, which would require a more in-depth tree survey. We wouldn't recommend requiring a tree survey to remove a single tree on a single family residential lot, just a notification.
Great, thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, continue on, Alex.
Okay, very good. So that really covers the key issues 8 and 9, which we saw last week, but just wanted to go over those revised numbers with you. So moving on to key issue 5, the tree permit process. The main idea here is that the city reviews tree permits when they are associated with projects and plans, but not when they're not associated. So if a homeowner just needs to remove a tree, there's no way for the city to track that, or there's no way to check to see which species it is. And so the ad hoc committee had decided to make the recommendation that a permit process would be created for all tree removal. So the section of the code is here under the significant tree preservation. There is section D for permit plan requirements. And as we just said, there's no process for other than with a permit. So option 1 would be to keep the existing language. Option 2 would be to change D to be tree permits associated with a project permit, and then add E, tree permits not associated with a project permit or plan. And so the idea here is to, as Courtney just referred to, have an administrative permit that is something that is that would not require a tree survey. It would be a city application that the applicant would complete and turn into Courtney's department, and that basically just confirmation that they are meeting the minimum tree retention requirements and that they comply with all of the requirements in the section. And that permit review process would be more of a streamlined process through her department. And so it would happen through city staff. Then having a component here for a permit for Oregon white oaks. And so that's Gary oaks. And we'll get to that in a little bit as well. They referring to the same tree, but we are proposing to change it to say Oregon white oaks to be consistent with other terminology like from the state and in other parts of the code.
Alex,
So,
excuse me, 1 minute. Mr. Buer has a comment.
Sure.
I just want to bring to the attention to the commission that Courtney Brunel is talking about an administrative permit process. It's probably going to be 1 page. And this is something that we looked at in the city of Sumner where they do this for fences, and it works really well. For those not proposing major changes or minor changes to their landscaping with trees, we believe that this process will work very easily for most property owners and will go a long ways in sort of expediting tree removal permits on single-family residential properties where it is appropriate to do so. So we think this has merit, and we can work on the details later, but I just wanted to talk about the fact that we've seen this work for fences. I think we can make it work for trees.
Great, thank you, Mr. Buer. Mr. Person.
So the administrative permit criteria 3. So does that mean if your site plan doesn't comply with the tree retention requirements, then it goes to an arborist or additional city staff for review?
Alex, could you stop?
What's
sharing
the
your screen?
intent there? Like if you have a good plan, then it just gets an administrative approval. But if you have a bad plan, then it goes to like.
Sure. Courtney, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what you said there.
If you stop sharing your screen, I can share the draft, and that might be helpful for the permit. Okay.
Sure.
So this is something that we have drafted, and I also pulled up, Dave, you were reading my mind. This is where we've seen it work in Sumner. They have a 1 page that basically summarizes their code. Somebody signs at the bottom saying they read this and they're complying with it. So we've adopted something similar, though with trees, there are a little bit more information that we need to gather. Like I mentioned, the number of trees to be retained, the number of trees to be removed, are any of them oak trees? The idea behind the simple admin permit is that they're retaining and meeting our requirements. Let's say that they said some of them are oak trees, and we as a city have put in place additional protections on oak trees. That would be when we give them a call back and say, we're going to need additional information, you're going to need additional permitting, and possibly involve an arborist. But assuming that all of this meets the code, it would just be this 1 page document that would be submitted. No site plan would even necessarily be required unless they are surpassing the threshold that we've identified for the number of trees that can be removed, or it's in a critical area or wetland, and maybe they didn't realize that they needed additional information.
Thanks. And then through GIS, can you guys identify the different trees pretty easily? I mean, I know when I look at GIS, it's like, looks like a green blob. So how do you know like how many trees there are and specifically like what kind, you know, if it's cedar or Gary oak or whatever?
GIS has a lot of those resources. We can identify the number of stems through GIS imaging. Alex, do you want to speak to the species? I can tell from looking at them certain species already, but I'm sure that you have better information.
Sure. Yeah. So the technology isn't there yet to have that as a standard tool at this point. I think it will get there eventually, but at this point, the best way to look is by looking at Google Street View, confirming at least which trees are in the front yard that way. And you can also ask for the applicant to submit pictures if that's something that you want to do.
Great. Mr. Buer.
Don't be surprised as we go through this that you see the city recommending that we have an arborist available under contract when we have specific questions. I think that's going to be a requirement for some of the projects that we're going to get into.
Great. And Mr. Combs.
Hoping to understand a little bit, and the form is a good start. I know it's just a draft version too, so we can make some easy changes to have it work if that's the route we go. I just couldn't help but think, where are we losing our canopy to right now? You know, we talk about the shortage of it, and as Mr. Buer mentioned last week, it's existing shortage right now. And so who are we, where's the greatest loss? Like, what are we defending against? Is it single family homeowners who are just taking down all the trees? Or is it, you know, on the larger lots? And perhaps you've already identified it and answered this, but I was going through the notes the other night and I couldn't find anything on it.
Yeah, so I'm trying to reopen some of those files right now so I can see where the greatest loss was.
I believe it was in the right of way. The right of way was the one area that we did see a negative canopy growth. Overall, the city's canopy did grow, which makes sense with just natural tree growth. But in the right of way, we did see a slight reduction. From the ad hoc committee, we had an individual whose profession is tree removal. And he said that the majority of, again, Gary Oaks that are removed are on single family residential lots. Commercial and industrial, we can track that using permitting because permits are required to remove trees generally in those areas. But for the single family residential lots, specifically those under 17,000 square feet, it was reported to us that many are removed without the city having record of it. Overall, though, what we've seen is that the canopy has continued to grow, although small growth overall, with the exception of the right of way.
Mr. Buer.
Going back to some of what was said already, loss of trees in the right of way, that's because we're putting in curbs, gutters, and sidewalks, and we're not putting in street trees. So that may very well be a recommendation that the commission gives to the city councils, that when you do major capital improvement projects to improve access or non-motorized transportation, you make sure that you also include trees. That will take care of part of the problem that we're seeing. Street trees are a requirement for development projects, but for when the city has gone out in the past for curb, gutter, and sidewalk projects, Public Works and Engineering has chosen to not require the trees so that they can build more curb, gutter, and sidewalk.
Thank you. Mr. Estrada.
Yeah, it sounds like an internal problem there. But I had a question regarding, we've mentioned the use of an arborist a couple of times here. Wasn't there one on the ad hoc committee?
There was not a certified what might there may have been. I'm not certain. I don't believe that we had a certified arborist on the ad hoc committee.
So if not, who then confirmed the type of trees that we would need and the growth of the trees that we wanted to plant? Who determined that then?
So I'm sorry. Planet Geo provided those recommendations, and they certainly are. But I thought you were referring to the ad hoc committee members themselves.
Yes, I was referring to the ad hoc. So we didn't have one there, but the recommendations then came from those other than arborists.
Correct.
Oh,
The ad hoc committee was appointed from the city council. They reviewed applications that were submitted. We did have presentations, of course, from Planet Geo, as well as WDFW, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, so a biologist, who came in to provide some information and make recommendations. But ultimately, the ad hoc committee was not comprised completely of arborists by any means. It was property owners, those with environmental interests. We did have a horticulturist on site, several business owners, and representatives from the development community.
Great. Okay, continue on, Alex.
Yeah.
Okay. Sharing my screen again. And so both Chris Pfeiffer and myself are certified arborists. And so we did provide education and information to the committee as they asked questions. And so as part of the protection standards for Oregon white oaks that are proposed, we have an additional permit process to be created here for Oregon white oaks. And so that would be, if there are oaks on the property, then permits would be required for removal, topping, and trimming. And so a few key points to cover. Removal or topping would require a permit, and that would be, approval would be determined by the director of the department. And then Oregon white oak trees greater than 20 inches or trees located within a critical area are subject to the critical areas ordinance. And so that refers over to chapter 14 and would be another set of protection standards for those trees. And then Oregon white oak stands or individual trees with an average DBH between 4 inches and 20 inches may be removed subject to these conditions that they're not within a critical area and that there are no other siting alternatives. And then that tree replacement would be required at a 3-to-1 ratio. So we went through that exercise, what a 2-to-1 ratio would be for that is currently in the code. And it is proposed here that there would be a 3-to-1 ratio for Oregon white oaks.
Excuse me, Alex.
Yes.
If I could, Don Daniels here, if I could ask on right above, we're just at number A, that A individual Oregon white oaks greater. What is where'd you go? Okay, what is approval is granted via reasonable use exception as outlined? What's that? On number A, right down the last sentence. Says that, yeah, go ahead.
Reasonable use exceptions are a permit process outlined in the critical areas ordinance. So what this is saying is that very large Oregon white oaks over 20 inches, and we got the definition of large from WDFW's recommendations, their management recommendations, because Oregon white oaks are priority habitats, identified as a Washington State priority habitat. They would be pushed into the critical areas ordinance. A reasonable use exception is similar to a conditional use permit, where it goes through a public hearing process in front of the hearing examiner. The applicant has to make a reason that this tree has to be removed, that there is no alternate reasonable use of this property should the tree remain. And then the hearing examiner, if they were able to make those findings, and I'm summarizing the findings, would say that the tree could or could not be removed. This is adopted from, or very similar to what we see in Oak Harbor. And as we receive public comments, you'll see Oak Harbor mentioned a lot. They are one agency that has adopted stricter regulations pertaining to Oregon white oaks. It's interesting to point out that the only tree that they protect as a jurisdiction are oak trees. They have no other tree preservation standards whatsoever in their code. But any Oregon white oak, and for them it's greater than 6 inches, is considered a critical area, and it's through a reasonable use exception or similar to a conditional use permit that those trees are able to be removed.
Thank you for your explanation. Okay, continue on.
Okay, great, thank you. And so a trimming permit would also be required through this process as well. So we're going to touch more on the Oregon white oak in the next key issue that gets into more detail on significant tree definitions. So this option 2 here is really the only option other than keeping the code the same, because it was pretty much the option of, do we change the code to this or do we not? And then also, of course, any recommendations that you may have that you think make more sense for the code, definitely up for discussion at this point, or you can include that on your spreadsheet to send back to Courtney. And Courtney, did you want to talk about the fiscal impact on this?
Yes, right. So for the fiscal impact for tree permits, right now we have no cost recovery for tree permits. So it's zero cost for commercial, industrial, single family residential when permits are required today. So we most recently did a cost recovery model in 2019 as a development services team. Additionally, throughout 2020, we have had a planner on contract through AHBL who has submitted summaries of how many hours it's taken him to review different permit types. So we do have some fairly concrete data about how long it takes to review different types of permits. For tree removal permits specifically, we estimate between 2 to 8 hours for tree removal permits. The 2019 fee schedule set staff time for that 80% cost recovery at $92 per hour. So with that, we would recommend a permit fee ranging from $150 to $590 for those permits that require additional review. So not for the certification that would be sent and rubber stamped. This would be for those where we have to look at tree credits. That's currently something that's in our existing tree preservation code. We maybe have to do a site visit. We maybe have to have an arborist involved. We have to look at mitigation standards and assigning those mitigation standards and drafting a staff report. We do a lot of that work already today on some of the larger tree removal projects, but we do not have any fee. Most jurisdictions do. So Lakewood's fairly unique in the fact that we have no fee for tree removal permits for all permit types. There are other jurisdictions that have a model similar to ours where they are $0 to get in the door, and then after staff review is complete, a fee is assessed at the time of permit issuance.
Mr. Combs.
Courtney, when you say most, are we talking about of the largest 30 cities? I mean, I don't want to exercise you, but I'm wondering, are we looking at all the ones that we're trying to model after? Or are we looking at all of them?
We looked at several, over around 10, and we have that data. So I can get you the spreadsheet. We can send that as an email after this meeting.
That I remember seeing a list before. I just wasn't sure if it included all the ones we were just modeling after, or if it's just ones that, I mean, obviously Lacey, University Place, all the ones that are really close to us would make a lot of sense. And even if they don't agree with what it is we're recommending, it makes sense to see what they're doing and know, even if there's no action on it. I think that it says something too.
Absolutely. Yep. We will send that chart out.
Thank
you. All right, continue on.
Okay, very good. So this is the beginning of key issue 6, where we're discussing significant tree definition and the critical areas concerning Oregon white oak. So Courtney, do you want to, at this point, did you want to give a little background?
Yes. So at our last meeting, towards the end of the meeting, it was asked, what are we working towards? What are we up against? And I mentioned a bit about the testimony that had been given in front of the planning, or in front of the city council, and some, I believe, in front of the planning commission as well, about the importance of Oregon white oaks. What I didn't mention was that in addition to that testimony, we are also receiving appeals on land use decisions that involve the removal of Oregon white oaks. Staff, of course, does our best to abide by our existing code, but there have been some spots that have been identified that are different than what is required by WDFW, specifically protections for individual oak trees, that has caused some confusion for us to administer and has also resulted in a hearing examiner decision that didn't necessarily agree with the city. Right now, we have one outstanding appeal. We've had 3 in total, and we're expecting a couple more, all involving Oregon white oaks. So this is another issue where, if nothing else came from the tree code update, we're hoping to have some clarity involving this issue because it's become very difficult to administer. And as you, I'm sure, can imagine, appeals are very timely. They take a lot of staff time and a lot of resources, and having the clarity built into the code for approving or denying these permits and aligning or justifying not aligning with the management recommendations from the state would be very helpful. So with that, we can go over what we have right now and what we're proposing to potentially change.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, so yes, as Courtney said, the idea is that Gary Oaks, if we were to explore a greater protection standard for them, then this is what we're looking at. So currently, the code identifies that a significant tree is a protected tree. And so a significant tree is a tree that doesn't matter if it's deciduous or evergreen. Once it reaches a 9-inch diameter, then it becomes a significant tree. And then for a Gary oak tree specifically, once it reaches a diameter of 6 inches, and then it becomes a protected tree. And when we refer to DBH, that's diameter at breast height, which is 4.5 feet off the ground. And a little bit of background on why Gary oak trees may have it might make sense for them to have a lower threshold here. Gary oaks have a slower growth rate, and so they can be much older than a Douglas fir tree, but be much smaller in diameter. And so this gives a little bit of background for you. The pieces of this code that we wanted to go over are section A for standards, and G, which goes over replacement, which we referred to a little bit in the last section as well. And then H for trimming. And then as well, there's a definition in chapter 14 for priority Oregon white oak woodland. So option 1 would be to keep everything the same. Option 2 would be to lower the threshold for Oregon white oaks to 4 inches rather than 6 inches. And that is in the same spirit of it having a slower growth rate. Just a little bit about the 4 inches. It isn't uncommon for specific species that are of higher importance to have a lower threshold than other trees. And we have seen 4 inches as a threshold for some trees in other cities as well. However, in the region, it would be one of the lowest, if not the lowest, threshold for Oregon white oak protection standards. Also included here is a recommendation to, which we went over in the last section as well. Once they reach the diameter of 20 inches, then they are automatically kicked into the priority area. And so it's a habitat of local importance as designated by chapter 14. And so then would have additional protection standards. So as far as replacement standards, we wanted to provide a few options here. The first one being based on the DBH size, which is, and this is going back to all significant trees at this point, currently have an on-site replacement based on DBH size with the 2-to-1 ratio. So we wanted to add a few options here so that you could also have replacement based on canopy coverage. And we would look into allowing fewer replacement trees than required if a certified arborist determines with a written report that they will compensate for the canopy that has been lost with the tree removal that's occurring. And then option C, and option C here is referring specifically to Oregon white oaks that once they are greater than 4 inches in DBH, they should have that 3-to-1 replacement ratio. And then we're proposing as well that, I'm sorry, this is based on the ad hoc committee's recommendations. We've included these specifications to have Oregon white oak protection standards during construction operations. So this is common for codes to have critical root zone protection standards. This is so that the trees aren't damaged during construction, that the soil isn't compacted too much during construction, and that you keep sharp tools, heavy machinery just away from the tree in itself. So typically it's, it's helpful to have those fence requirements and also signage and all of that being based on, this is specifically for Oregon white oaks. This would not be for all trees. And then we would be also recommending a change to the definition so that over in chapter 14 for priority Oregon white oak woodland, that a single oak or stands of oaks could be designated as priority Oregon white oak woodland. And that goes back to the 20-inch DBH designation. So I covered a lot of information there. Ready for questions or for Courtney to go over the fiscal impact.
Mr. Wegman.
So have you thought about how long a tree is going to live? I mean, is there a life cycle that would be brought into some of the decisions about some of these trees? And then the second part of that question is when you talk about considering the roots, certainly in the city of Lakewood, we've got the water district in here. I've seen some water meters that have been just wrapped in roots. And then what do you do? It makes it pretty difficult to get your water line. So how do we repair that? Or do we just tell people they can't live there anymore?
So
You want to go for, you start with the age and then I can answer the permitting.
sure. So for a lot of urban trees, we do see a shorter lifespan than what they would experience in in a forested area where there aren't as many risks or hazards involved. So for some trees, it can be as short of a lifespan as 40 to 60 years. However, with oak trees that have protection standards in place, like here in Florida, we have the southern live oak tree, can live for hundreds of years. So I just recently visited an oak tree that was supposed to be 600 years old. So with oak trees, it really has to do with the protection standards, how much soil quality is available to the tree. And so Oregon white oaks have that potential as well. But it depends on the growing conditions.
And for permitting, there is under the removal, if it is determined to be damaged, diseased, hazardous, or I think that the way that we suggested the wording, endangering any life, then it will be able to be removed. For the water district, for example, I spoke with the planning department in Oak Harbor, and what they would do is have either their staff arborist or a hired arborist go out and provide a recommendation to attempt to save the tree when it comes to utility, the correct way to cut around it in order to cause minimal damage to the critical root zone or no damage to the critical root zone. And they found that to be successful in most instances. They said that in 10 years, there's been one instance where they've had to have a tree removed due to a public utility, an Oregon white oak tree removed due to a public utility. Otherwise, they typically find ways that they can work around them.
Mr. Pearson.
Yeah, thanks. So, key issue 6 is a key issue for sure. And I feel like, we really, the options are do nothing or do everything. And so, I think there is some good information in here. In general, I don't like, adding in an individual Oregon white oak. I think that it makes a lot of sense to keep the stands and to do the, aren't those a critical area already? Like stands of Gary or of the white oaks?
Yes, stands with an average,
Sorry, go.
stands with an average diameter breast height of 20 inches are considered a critical area under our existing code regulations. Under the state code regulations, it's those individual oaks that are 20 inches.
Oh, okay. So it is a single tree is a critical area,
but not in the city. And that's what we've received the appeals on.
Okay. Yeah. And, let's see here, G replacement. I think that it would just be easier to keep all of the replacements at 2 to 1 instead of, and then not allowing for an arborist to reduce it. To me, that just, you make someone hire a consultant for nothing, I don't really like that. I just would keep it at 2 to 1 to be consistent with the rest of the replacement. And then, this is a lot of changes and just a lot of meat to chew on for the average person trying to, see if they can cut a tree down in their yard or not. And so, I think that we need to be thoughtful to the folks that are in the situation, looking at this. And then the Oregon white oak protection item I or L, I don't know what it is. But there's this, the CRZ protection isn't, are those requirements as part of like grading permits or somewhere else, for like just your normal protected trees, the significant trees, I guess, why the difference, or shouldn't all significant trees be, protected in like in an equal manner, I guess? Is there any?
Courtney, is this located anywhere else in the code?
No, right now we do not have a critical root zone specifically. We do have construction requirements like establishing fencing for all significant trees, but the critical root zone is something that we would adopt. What we recommended was specifically for Oregon white oaks, or proposing is specifically for Oregon white oaks. But you could certainly apply the same standard to all significant trees as defined that aren't proposed to be removed. And yes, I would recommend that we would attach this to a site development permit or a building permit via a stamp, to make sure you're referencing these regulations if any proposed construction is going to take place on a lot that has tree coverage.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, just kind of my general thoughts are, I obviously have heard the folks' concerns about the Gary Oaks, and I think that option B is a little bit extreme, and option A is doing nothing. And so I think that the city would not, I don't know if people would be too happy if we did nothing, but I also think that it'd be pretty tough for development if we did this entire adopted this entire code. So,
Mr. Buer.
So Courtney, I have a question. This is Dave.
Go ahead.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm going to just for fun. Say the city of Lakewood is involved in a sidewalk project, and the sidewalk project requires that there's a large Gary oak where the sidewalk is supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
What would the city do with its plans to build the sidewalk with these new regulations? What are your thoughts on that?
I think you would have final call. No, if you want to go up to the removal, it specifically says that trees can be removed if there's no other siting for certain types of improvements. Now, if it was over 20 inches, we might have some problems. If we did determine that a 20-inch tree by itself is a critical area. And again, we're looking for clarity through this process. We're not looking to adopt everything necessarily. It's simply just clarity and showing that we've gone through this exercise. But if an individual or single oak became a critical area, we would probably go through the same reasonable use exception to remove that tree or ask that the sidewalk be designed around it.
Which may mean that the city of Lakewood would have to acquire additional right-of-way from a property owner, which
Yes,
may
and that
mean
does
that we
happen.
have to use eminent domain to save the tree.
Mm-hmm. And that does happen in other jurisdictions. And really quickly, just to talk to Mr. Pearson's comments about the options, the way that I formatted it on the matrix is slightly different than the way that we have it here in the document. I made it so option 2 is just reducing the significant tree to 4 inches. Option 3 is taking on the 20-inch for critical areas, and option 4 is the construction operations. So in that one, you'd want to highlight multiple options. And that is the case. I tried to break it down on a couple of these that were kind of multifaceted in case there were certain ones that you didn't agree with and other portions that you did.
Courtney, another option for my tree example on the sidewalk, would the city have to, if it wanted to, go through a reasonable use exception permit for a large oak tree? Would
Yes,
that be an option?
yes. That would also be an option, at which point it's no longer a staff determination. It becomes a hearing examiner's determination and goes through public comment and public review.
Great. Okay, continue on, Alex.
All right. Okay, I thought maybe someone else had a question, their hand up. Okay. So moving on to key issue 7 for the heritage tree designation. Now, the ad hoc committee was interested in a voluntary heritage tree program. And so a heritage tree program such as this that is proposed would be a way for community members to voluntarily recognize specimen trees in the community that have a certain level of importance based on history, culture, or environmental importance. And what, after discussing with Courtney and the team, it looked like the Chapter 2 Protection and Preservation of Landmarks was a really great place to put this program, because there's already a process outlined here in this section of the code with designation criteria and a process with committee tied to it as well. So looking down to option 2 here, we have within this section for the designation criteria, we have added D, which would allow for this process for a tree to become designated as a heritage tree. And one important piece of this code is that the landowner, the property owner, must sign on and be a part of the application, because this is not something where anyone can go designate a tree on someone else's property. And but the application would be fairly simple, with a description of the tree, the size, the reason for designation, and then a report by a certified arborist to identify the tree's characteristics, current condition, and maintenance needs. And that would help to paint the full picture of the tree, the conditions of the tree, and the future of the tree. And then getting into preservation of heritage trees, going back to Chapter 18, we would then have to add preservation criteria for heritage tree removal. And so not only would you need the ISA certified arborist report to designate the tree, but you would need a report to remove the tree as well. And then there would be other factors taken into account, but this basically, if the tree were to be granted for removal, it would be on the basis that there's some health or safety concern, infrastructure concerns, and maybe a reasonable use of property per state law. So recommendations for care of the tree will also be considered rather than removal. So that gives you a basic overview, and anything that you want to add here, Courtney, on the fiscal impact.
Just that from an administrative perspective, this has a very relatively low fiscal impact. We already have the Landmarks and Heritage Advisory Board. Staff is already dedicated to these board meetings. We already hold public hearings for other landmarks. The only fiscal impact I could think of was a plaque or some sort of recognition if we wanted to include that for these trees. Right now, those are about $85 per plaque. And then advertising for the public hearing that would be required as part of the News Tribune averages about $200.
Mr. Combs.
Is the heritage tree something, the way I read this, and maybe I missed it, is the heritage tree something that the property owner still owns and it's only the property owner that designates it, or is there someone else? Like, did you say the community could designate one?
One of the required findings as part of the existing Landmarks and Heritage Advisory Board designation process is that they have to make a finding to the city council that the property owner agrees with the designation. And so it would still be owned by the designee or the property owner, It's important to note that there is also a process for terminating a Lakewood landmark that's outlined in the code and that this would be part of. And it's essentially the exact same process, but in reverse, where they'd apply for termination, that would be reviewed via public hearing, recommendation, and then assuming, approved by city council if the property owner was no longer interested in participating in the program.
Got it. I'm sorry. So once you're in this heritage tree, I guess I was thinking of this as more significant, but so yeah, I guess I'll save my questions for later. That's good.
Okay, yes, Mr. Pearson.
These heritage trees are probably younger than most of the people sitting in this room. And, the 40 years feels like a little young for a heritage. I mean, when I think of a heritage tree, I'm thinking of like something that when you go to Maui, you go to that tree that's like ancient and huge. Is this a standard age, or should it maybe be like, do some places have it at 75 years or 100 or 60 or I feel like 40 is a little young to be considered a heritage tree rather than just your typical yeah.
I know that 40 years is the requirement for structures. Alex, can you go back up to the red line for what the requirements would be for a tree? Okay, so for the portion above D8, that's for a structure. For the trees, we don't necessarily have an age associated with it. It would be that it is some type of, historical, unique characteristics, cultural significance. But I would expect, just based off of what I've experienced, that the majority of these would be very large decadent oaks, or maybe decadent maples or something along those lines.
Thanks.
Great. Okay. Mr. Combs.
So if this is, I assume this gets recorded somehow. Does it get onto title? How does a new property owner know that they have a heritage tree?
It doesn't go on title. No, it's, and we've assigned Lakewood landmarks via either proclamation or resolution via the city council, and then we add them to a list. Right now, all of our Lakewood landmarks are structures, though there is an option for it to also be a natural resource. We don't have any natural resources designated as Lakewood landmarks, but it does not go on the title report.
Okay.
Thank you. Continue on. Oh, excuse me, Ms. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could I please request on section D there, what does environmental significance to the community mean? Is that something that's a phrase used in other jurisdictions, or how would the term environmental in particular be used in this case?
And
go
ahead.
I was just going to say that it isn't referring to some other thing that isn't defined here. So it's really just if there is a significance to the property itself for environmental reasons, it's really subject to on a case-by-case basis here.
Okay, I immediately go to, is this defined as it would be under the State Environmental Policy Act? Is it, you learn the term environment in elementary school and have a certain understanding for what that means, or if there's some other term of art we're referring to here? So it's basically case-by-case basis, and the proposal that's brought in front of the city to consider?
Yes, and it would be whoever's nominating the natural resource would be the one to bear the burden of proof of its environmental significance.
Okay.
And then that would be reviewed by the Landmarks and Heritage Advisory Board and the recommendation forwarded to council.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. No problem. Thank you. Continue on.
Okay, thank you. So we're on to key issue 10 for the city tree fund clarity. And the way that Lakewood's code is currently structured is that the city tree fund has two sections for funding sources and then for funding purposes. And within the funding sources, penalties tied to settlements, donations, grants, and then other monies as allocated by city council are included in the sources section. So the idea here would be to add clarity by adding, if there is a tree permit fee added, then we would want to include that here and any penalties from that process as well, so that those funds could be directed to the city tree fund. And then in the funding purposes section, to further enhance the Oregon White Oak programming, then we would be adding a funding purpose for Oregon White Oak restoration or enhancement projects. And that is it for this section. Anything on this key issue before we go to the next one?
Nope. Sounds good.
Okay, and then for the fines. So the city, as we just stated, does collect fines and deposit into the city tree fund. But the main piece about this that has come up as a staff issue is that the fees and fines may be reduced in court. And so the thought here, as through discussion with the ad hoc committee, is that changing the section of the code to include some preventative measure here, so that it's not, so that the fees themselves are not dismissed very easily by the person who is doing the cutting of the trees. And so we've seen this in other codes, that there's language to add, this is under the replacement section, when offsite replacement is not a viable option. On-site replacement is not a viable option when offsite replacement is maybe too much, then they would go to payment in lieu of replacement. And so that is already built into the code here, but this section E would provide that willful or malicious cutting may result in tripling of the amount of the replacement value. And that refers back to the previous section of the code. So this would be, and Courtney, if you want to expand on this at all, so that those fees cannot be so far reduced that it's almost incentivized for people to just do that.
Sure. So right now what we find is that when people remove trees when they shouldn't have, so they're not exempt and they did so without a permit, we assign a fee based off of the standard mitigation outlined in the code, because that's all that makes sense for us to do with the way our code is currently written. And so let's say that we assigned a $20,000 fee. That is the same amount that in theory they would have been charged as a fee in lieu of had they come in for a permit application. So we are only recovering the amount of costs that they would have originally incurred if they had tried to come into compliance. When somebody doesn't come into compliance, we assign that as a citation rather than a replacement fee. And then that citation is typically taken to court, where it's reduced to 1/3. And so individuals who are removing trees illegally are paying 1/3 of what they likely would have paid had they gone through the permit process. Granted, they didn't have the opportunity for on-site replacement, but we always go for voluntary compliance first, and these fees are only assigned after there are many attempts by staff to have these folks come in and make a permit application. So this is something we've seen several times, where fees have been reduced down to 1/3, and this tripling, maybe it's a standard. This is something that we saw from the city of Seattle, and they may be dealing with the same exact issue we are, where 1/3 is the typical court reduction. So even if it was reduced to 1/3, we would still be at least collecting the same amount that they would have paid toward the program had they removed the tree with permits.
Seeing no questions, go right ahead.
Okay. And so this is our last key issue for today, key issue 12, which is for incentives. And so this is something that through conversations with the ad hoc committee, we absolutely wanted to explore creative ways to bring together different issues that the city is facing and come up with creative solutions for how to incentivize tree protection through other processes that are already happening at the city. So we've included a small chart here with some ideas. So we'll just go through these one by one. The first one is for a parking incentive, and that would allow for a a parking reduction based on tree protection. And so I've included links to the different sections of the code so you can reference if you'd like. But the addition, the potential code language here would be that for each significant tree preserved on the property, the required number of parking spaces could be reduced by 0.5 spaces, and then not to exceed 5% of the total required parking. And this was modeled after a similar incentive for electric vehicle charging stations. So similar structure, similar language, just modified for tree protection.
There is one Scribner's error in that first one. It says heritage trees, and it should be critical protection or preservation of significant trees, not heritage trees.
Yes, thank you. I'll just change that right now. So we're looking at what it should say. Okay. And this second incentive here is for increasing density for multifamily developments in the downtown district. And this is specifically because the downtown district and heavy commercial and industrial areas tend to experience the heat island effect more than other areas of the city. And so in this section of the code, the proposed code language would be to increase density by 1 unit for each significant tree preserved on the property. And then for, let's see, this was for the tree equity score. So for multifamily use types, maximum density may increase by 1 unit for each significant tree preserved on a property that is located in a census tract with a tree equity score of under, and this would be a number that we would agree upon as the city, but not to exceed more than 20% of the total allowable units. And just to give a little bit of reference here, currently Lakewood's tree equity score is 69 for the entire city. Now, some of the census tracts in the city have a score of 100, which is the best, and then some are down in the 30s and 40s. And so this is something that you would want to look at if you have a goal to increase tree equity in certain census tracts.
Mr. Buer has a question.
Very briefly, either for Alex or Courtney, I know you said downtown district, but wouldn't we want to include the Lakewood Station District as well?
We certainly could. The Lakewood Station District has a higher tree equity score than the downtown district, but we could. And that's what we were looking at with the 18A, expanding this. If we like this idea of increasing density, we could apply it throughout the city, not just to the downtown.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, Mr. Pearson.
Oh,
Oops, go ahead.
okay. So when, say you have a stand of Gary Oaks, that's a critical area. Is that included in your density calculation, or is that withheld?
It's included in your density calculation.
Sorry, what was that?
It's included.
Okay. And so, yeah, I guess I kind of like the idea of, if you have some other significant trees, not just a stand of Gary Oaks, like that is a significant or a critical area. I think that would be kind of beneficial for not just, I don't know, this whole thing just seems like we have significant trees and then we have Gary Oaks, and I feel like they should all be significant trees, and they're all protected. So in some way. So anyway, thanks.
Ms. Spear?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you scroll up to the prior item? Is this item 18A 80060 regarding parking? Did you talk at all about having that also apply in either sub area, so 18B or C?
I would recommend that change. Yes, that we'd attach it to every code section.
Okay. And just, I know this will be perhaps somewhat confusing for the public or the planning commission or council, because we have the parking comprehensive plan amendment going through right now with the comprehensive plans items, which will be in front of you next week, as well as tree preservation. And this is a separate amendment related to parking. So we'll just try to keep that clear for you.
Yeah, we were trying to brainstorm any incentive that we could come up with that fit within the existing development regulations to present this evening. But yes, I agree. 18B and 18C should be factored in.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Continue on.
Yes, thank you. And I just wanted to add that Lakewood's code has great incentives already built in. So it was really pretty easy to come into the code and be able to add some of these options here because you already have the structure for it, which really says a lot. I think your code is in support of incentives, which is fabulous. And so it makes it a lot easier to explore these options. So as we continue on, this is for section 18B, the master plan development town center incentive overlay. And this allows for flexibility in the master plan. And this is one of those examples that there are a list already of different variables for allowing flexibility in the master plan. And so we've added an option for preservation of significant trees on the property as one of those options. And then moving on to 18C, in the optional master plan development, again, including tree preservation as a criteria or condition of approval for mixed income developments. The list was already there, so we were able to add in some suggested language here for the preservation of 5% of the existing significant trees on the property as identified by a tree survey, and then not greater than 5 significant trees. So we can pull that part of the code up if it helps to provide some more context there. And then 18A for landscaping standards for a landscaping reduction. So giving a credit of 1.5 square feet of landscaping requirement for every, for the preservation of an Oregon white oak tree. Let's see. And that was for every square foot of area devoted to the new or preservation of Oregon white oak tree. So anything else that you want to add here, Courtney?
No, the fiscal impact is already pretty much built into our existing permitting process. So it will be relatively low to monitor for these incentives.
Mr. Combs.
On the square footage that you're talking about for the landscaping, is that based off of the canopy coverage?
Yes, the critical root area or drip line is probably what we would consider, or as much of it as they would be willing to preserve surrounding those oaks would be credited elsewhere on the property.
All right, thanks for clarifying. We can probably add that in there too, once we get there.
Okay, any other questions? I see no other hands. All right, continue on.
Okay, and this was the end of what we had to present today. So happy to go over any of the other key issues, any other questions that you may have.
If you want to stop sharing your screen, Alex, I would like to spend a little bit more time on the matrix just to make sure, as I mentioned, a couple of them are set up to just identify the individual options pretty clearly. And then as we get down to, for example, significant oaks, we've broken up the second option into 3. So here you might like all of them and decide to highlight all of them yellow or just 1 or 2, so on and so forth. And then for incentives, I've combined them all, but if you have other recommendations, please go ahead and put them into the other category.
Okay, any other questions now? Go ahead. Mr. Pearson.
So if we, took the Bentley approach to trees here, how many staff would we have to hire to, regulate all of this?
If you were to remove exemptions entirely, which I'm not sure from a staffing perspective we would recommend, but if you chose to take that approach and we were looking at including 11,000 additional property owners to potentially apply for some type of permitting, and create an urban forestry program, we'd probably be looking at least 1 FTE, likely 2.
Thanks.
My calculation would be at least 1 FTE. So just say $100,000 to $115,000. And if you add in a tree person under contract for services, you can just put in 150. So on the low side, $160,000. That's what you're looking at. So when we go to the city council and talk about budget, they're going to be asking us, So you're going to have to find a way to provide an offset at least 80% of those costs. And the council may say no, and may say then we're going to have some sort of general fund subsidy as it relates to this. But that's up to them. The commission can also provide their own recommendation. But right now, looking at all that we do and the changes in what we're proposing and to sort of match up with Fish and Wildlife, my indication would be just right around 160. Now, if you're talking about going a little further and getting into some sort of tree replacement program, you can start adding costs. That's more.
And what Dave's referring to is there's other programs, for example, in the city of Sumner, where tree inventory is very low at nurseries right now. And I don't know if it's a nationwide problem, but it's certainly a regional problem where you go to nurseries and it's difficult to find mature trees or specific tree species. So some cities, Sumner is one example, have set aside land where they grow their own trees and they offer those to members of the public for a cost. They give them away and they also use them for street trees, and something like that would be an additional funding allocation, of course.
Any other questions, Mr.
Right.
Combs? Oh,
If you're talking about a full-on urban forestry program, my estimation is based upon some limited research is probably $500,000 a year for a city this size.
in the, Mr. Combs.
Are we going to comments or are we just doing questions right now?
I think it's anywhere, it's open mic night at this point.
I guess, I think I would be curious to get everyone's take on it and just talk openly. And I really want to be able to give Alex and Courtney something constructive to go back with as we're moving forward, because they've done such a large amount of work on this and it's exhaustive. It's so much to take in. I can only imagine if you're putting it together. And so appreciate all the great work so far. And I can tell you guys have both taken a look at this and tried to figure out how we can come up with something that might be more palatable and because based on reaction so far. And so I say that all to kind of prep you with what I'm about to say, which is I'm having trouble with, in general, the whole premise for extensive canopy growth. We're seeing negative reactions in cities around our region, and that, for those who have been aggressive on this. And I don't know that we are, what we're solving specifically. I've heard about the social equity, and we could talk a little bit about that. I imagine density is a high factor in that. And if you look in where we're most dense, that's also where most affordable housing is built, and that changes a whole area code or demographic for when you're measuring that. And if you look at cities like Tacoma and Seattle, they're different in how they do it. In most cities, the more you go into the city, the more expensive it gets. And as you can see in our city, our growth has happened based off of commercial development in areas, and you can see the impacts of it, and the costs are lower there for housing. And that's where more of the affordable housing is. So I'm not sure we're solving a social equity issue there, or at least I haven't been able to convince myself of it, although I'm wide open to discussion and more data on that. As far as increased canopy, that's, I like the idea of more trees. And so I'm not opposed to that, but I guess I'm trying to solve for something. And I haven't felt like we have had a shortage of trees. So I feel like based on when I looked up different cities around the region, Northwest in particular, we're high, or I mean, we're in the right range. We're in a very popular range, which is around 30%. And we're a little below that right now. So to me, my gut says, let's try and get something that we can achieve and that's not pie in the sky. And so I'm looking at how do we get something closer to that 30 mark or somewhere around there. And if it's a little bit more, then let's understand what that looks like and how we're going to get there. I don't want to create a policy or a change in ordinance or pass something that is trying to solve for something without looking at how we're going to get there. And if we can't realistically get there, then let's not create goals like that. And so I do think that 1,500 acres is not likely, and in my mind, not going to happen. But that was my initial reaction. So going through, those are the initial ones. I still am not understanding the solution because we are looking for alternative energy sources, and whether that's hydro, solar, wind. I mean, this all takes in that's a factor for real. And we can't solve the energy issues without looking at that. And Paul's brought it up several times. And I do think it's a real point, a real issue here. And as solar is becoming more and more affordable and popular, it's becoming the more and more likely candidate. So I'm not sure how that factors into this, but maybe I actually like the idea of a rhododendron tree, because there are some of them that 15, 20 feet tall that provide a ton of shade. And we sit under those at my house. So I think that they're probably 100 or 50 years old, and they have a 6-inch, plus diameter. So I would think that, I'm not saying that is how it should be, but I think that getting creative on that, but I still don't think we've solved for that energy portion. I'm not sure about the cost. I am sure that the costs are ridiculously high. And I'm concerned about the impact on staff as they are now, being spread even more thin. And so we have to have a real practical approach and not create a whole department dedicated to trees. We have big issues beyond just trees, which include housing and transportation, public safety. And I know you get that. So I'm preaching to the choir on that front, but we need this solution to be scaled to the size of the whole problem. And so I get that I get the ad hoc committee who did a wonderful job coming up with a lot of creative ideas and recommendations. I get why they would focus on let's swing for the stars or go for a home run. For me, I'm saying how do we hit a base hit so we can get some momentum, and then 5-10 years down the road see about getting a double. And because I feel like we'd come out further ahead than if we take a swing and get nothing. The cost also goes with enforcement, which is an ongoing thing. And I don't like biting off of, in my mind, in business and for the city, I don't feel like it's a good idea to create ongoing burdens. It's nice to get something where it comes in, goes out, and is done. But if we have a system where it's, creating a constant process for enforcing, the education is a great one. And maybe that's something that we can do within the city budget or submit to this city council, but without actually creating an enforcement thing. And I may be in the minority, but I'm a big fan of the carrot over the stick. I think that approach is a lot more effective when it comes to property rights, when it comes to the public and people in general. And so that would be my approach. I think maintaining the actual trees, if we do this with all the trees everywhere, and we own those trees, I've talked to the Parks Department. I realize you guys did too. I got different information. My information was we don't have enough resources to get to all the trees to maintain these properly right now. So if that's the case, then how realistically do we add more trees and effectively do it? Because I don't want to set us up to fail at this. If we're going to do this, we want to have this work. And I don't like the idea of putting a bunch of fees on there because that's not the kind of income we want. We don't want to have to charge everybody so we can, it's basically additional tax to the people who are doing this. So, sorry. And then I heard the eminent domain. That's a whole nother cost factor that we haven't taken in. And so, I'm sorry.
Well, no, go ahead. Whenever you're done.
So those are some of the cost things that really concern me. And we talked about something north of $500,000, which last time, and I'm encouraged by 160,000, although I don't think that's really, I don't know how sustainable that really is for all these things that I'm talking about. I would hope that's the case, but I am concerned about limiting property rights. I'm concerned about the impacts of that legally, and what kind of pushback we'll have. There's real costs associated with defending those in the court, developability, and taking it away from people so they can't do things with their property that they want to do. We've spent the last 2 years trying to build all these ADUs and places you can work from home. And I think a lot of those wouldn't have happened if they did happen here, based on some of these. So I love the idea of the simple form. Excellent start. If we go down the road of actually going through that process, I think that's an awesome stab at it. The one thing I would want to add, but I don't know if we even could, is some kind of reasonable accommodate or some reasonableness in there, because if we're asking them, to remove, if they're asking to remove a tree, or not asking, submitting for a permit, I feel like if someone's making a decision on it and it's someone who wants to keep the tree, that's conflict of interest. And obviously the person who's trying to get rid of the tree, there needs to be some kind of reasonableness where the public would think it's a reasonable thing, kind of like the jury would say, hey, that makes sense. Let's go ahead and allow that. If the tree's damaging the property, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. If it's tangled up in the plumbing, that seems reasonable too. And so going through those reasonableness, that's a hard one to define. Reasonableness is really difficult. So I have a difficult time with that. And when we can't get reasonable language in there, then it makes me think that it may not be worth it. But I do like the simple form. I will say the thing I'm most excited about was the incentives program. And I thought that everything in there made a lot of sense. The housing, you talked about having that citywide, ton of sense. I would say that's true for everything that lists downtown. I would just across the board put everything to the city, because if we really want to see that, let's motivate people to do it. And the parking one makes a ton of sense, because that parking is usually requiring you to take these trees out. And this kind of makes a nice balance. You do then have a problem with the lack of parking, but that's a problem we can talk about a little further and figure out some more. I just think that's a, spaghetti on the wall, good solution. Landscaping, having an additional requirement, great job. All those recommendations just made a ton of sense to me. I've got more thoughts, but I feel like I've probably gone overboard. The right of way though, based on our discussion last time, I'm really concerned that the right of way even is on the list. I can make some other recommendations. I worry a little bit if we're trying to put limits on right of way and easements when the practical application of it, like Mr. Buer is saying, there's so many scenarios where those trees are. On my way home, there's one inside where a sidewalk would go. It would be significant. And it's a Gary Oak. It's huge. Right now, I worry more that it's going to fall on a car. So I'm because it hangs over and it's being killed by ivy, and so there's a lot of that, kind of cross issues. And the last thing I'll say is related to the industrial or warehouses. I don't know that we're having a mass amount of issue related to that. We might be. And my initial reaction was, yeah, that's an easy place to start. But the more I've thought about it, if anyone's done any warehouses, they only function a certain way. And so we really have to come up with ways that you can still build that property. And so there has to be a solution to it. Not, it can't be done. It has to be, how do we come up with a buildable alternative? Because You can't put an effective operation with a couple trees inside of a building or chop up a property and a warehouse in a way that it doesn't work. And tenants won't take it. The warehouse tenants won't take it. It's not functional. So we've got to kind of solve that one a little bit better. But really home run on the incentives, and I'll turn the time back over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bueller.
A couple of things. First, keep in mind that we have a public hearing the first part of July. So before the hearing, the city staff has to prepare a draft ordinance. Well, the draft ordinance will cover all these topics except fees, which is by resolution. I'll get back to that in a moment. So it's going to be up to us to try to come forward and craft a draft ordinance for the public to take a look at prior to the public hearing. So we're going to try our best to try to ameliorate many of your comments to provide for a draft ordinance. So at your next meeting, I think we're going to hone in on some of that. So be prepared. However, there are some things you have accomplished tonight. So let's kind of go through that list. And on my list, item number 12, incentives, I think are fairly easy. We've all pretty much agreed that expand it beyond just 12A and 18A and 18 or 18B and C, but as much as possible encompass it throughout the entire code. Violations and enforcement, number 11, I think is a pretty easy one. And let me just go back and explain that a little bit more. The triple fee is for willful and malicious activity. That means this, you propose to remove a tree, Phil, Mr. Combs, and we come out to your site and we say it's a huge oak tree and you're in this oak grove and it is what it is. You really can't remove it, and here are your options. If you're going to remove it, you're going to have to go through this reasonable use exception permit. And you look at us and say, no. And then we tell you that you really need to abide by the law. And you say no, and you find some person to cut the tree down. That's willful and malicious. So in that particular instance, you're going to look at the triple fine. Okay, that doesn't happen very often. And most likely what we get into is a person who cuts down a tree and they're not willful and malicious. And so the process is we get a complaint, code enforcement goes out and takes a look at the situation, prepares a report. Both someone in the planning department and the legal department reviews that report and comes to a conclusion whether or not we're going to issue a citation. And with that citation, along with the appropriate amount of mitigation that is required, then that goes to municipal court. Keep in mind the municipal court has lots of issues on their desk, a lot of misdemeanor behavior and also domestic violence. So generally speaking, trees don't come up to the higher level of criteria that the judges are taking a look at. And so, yes, the fees may be reduced, but it's better than nothing. And one person has learned their lesson. So I don't really see that much change in the enforcement, except for those individuals who say, I'm not going to abide by the code. I am willfully and maliciously going to cut down trees, and I want to see what you're going to do to me. In those cases, usually the fines are in excess of $90,000. Okay, those go to municipal court. They get appealed to Superior Court because the fees are so large, it's worth it to hire an attorney to see if you can get the fee less. So that's why it's triple. This makes sense. So I don't think there's a real issue there in regard to enforcement. Otherwise, we just follow our current process.
I did have a question on that. I actually liked that one. That was the one that seemed most reasonable. The only question I had was on willful. That seems very subjective. And so I was curious if that language is universally adopted already, if that's something that, because willful could be defined, like, I think you meant to do that. And so versus what you just described to me as with intent and informed intent. And to me, that seems, if we can just clarify that term willful to exactly what you said, I'm on board with that today.
Okay.
But the willful just seemed a little ambiguous to me. So I hate to make it hard to define.
But we have this process that goes on behind the scenes that people aren't aware of. It is difficult to write a ticket. Okay, and those tickets are monitored by the department or from the state, those ticket books. So you have to be very careful when you do it. So it's not a simple process. It's not designed to be simple either.
And that language specifically was adopted from City of Seattle. So we can certainly amend it to be informed and malicious intent or something. Too.
I like the city of Seattle, but not always.
Mr. Beard, did you want to?
I do. I think Mr. Pearson had a question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mr.
so
Pearson.
the code enforcement, it sounds like that's not a huge deal right now, but if if those areas get changed to require permits everywhere or to reduce it to 10,000, then that is, potentially
Right.
a big
So
deal.
one of the things that the council and the city is going to have to do, if you make substantial changes to the code, it is important that just like we did when we started the code, when we sent out the postcard, letting people know, hey, we're going through this process. We're going to have to send out another postcard to those same individuals and letting them know we've made significant changes to the tree code. Here's a summary, but for more information, please go to this website. That is a critical key component to whatever we do, or whatever the city does upon adoption of a new code. And I'm expecting that the commission will make a recommendation that there be very specific outreach that's incorporated into any new code so that the public is aware of the changes well in advance. And I wouldn't be, I'll stop there. But I don't think that on the violation enforcement section, we're that far off.
Mr. Estrada.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do believe in the value and benefits of trees. And I do believe that we need all these policies and procedures and guidelines to retain them. There's a value there. And I also agree that the city has got to establish these policies, these procedures. In one, and looking at it from one perspective, for the good of many, I think sometimes the individual must either step aside or come on board, shall we say, again, for the good of many. Last week, you Alex, gave us some proposals, some options on goal planting priorities. And so I've gone through them, and I guess before I can make a decision, I need to know. So we're going to plant trees on the east side and the west side. I think that was the recommendation. So how long will it take a planted tree to be considered canopy? And the reason why I ask that is because it does depend on the type of tree that is planted. And what is considered canopy? How long is it going to take after you plant that tree?
Sure. It absolutely, of course, does depend on the species that you plant. And, there's what we consider canopy in our canopy analysis was greenery that's above 12 feet. So you can kind of think of trees as they get above 12 feet, then they're providing shade, and they become larger and are absorbing more storm water and all of that. So, but I think within 20 years, they are definitely at the point of maturing or maturity, depending on the species, of course. And then they continue to increase in ecosystem benefits that they provide at 40 years, and can even, continue to provide those as long as they have good living conditions until, 100 years, multiple hundreds of years. So I think looking at things in terms of after you plant the tree, the first 2 years are really pivotal for young tree watering, constant maintenance, and then beyond that, you'll start to see the growth that you need to see in order to start getting those benefits.
So your plan says by 2025, the minimum, we're going to have 27% canopy. But if it's going to take you many more years for a tree to grow, how do you get to 27% in 3 years?
So I'm sorry, I need to pull up my numbers here, but by 2025, so within 3 years, planting the number of trees to reach 27%.
Or even 26.5. Scenario 3 was 26.5. Scenario 2 was 26.5. Again, how do you get to that, even 26.5, if it's going to take you that many more years for that tree to grow and become canopy?
Hey, Alex, Chris Piper here with Planet Geo. I just wanted to chime in on the canopy side of things and how the percentages were calculated. It looks at the planning horizon that we apply to the canopy goal setting. So you're theoretically, if you're planting X number of acres, you'll reach 27% canopy by 2025. But you won't know that until full completion of the cycle of what you're recommended for the canopy goal. So there are recommendations to do 2 to 3 year reassessments of canopy to make sure that you are staying on track for that that calculated forecasted amount then. And also the 20 years is the standard applied to the canopy goal setting and canopy growth as defined by the Forest Service and other folks involved with the tools and technology for canopy assessments.
So it's the amount of trees you are planting then that eventually will become a canopy. So that's what we're saying. It's not that we're going to reach 27% or 26.5. It's that we've planted enough trees that eventually they'll get to 27.5.
That's right. Yep. And our working sheets that weren't made available for presentation also include the estimated number of trees to plant per year to reach that long-term acreage increase. And that's based on looking at different size trees that will be planted that have different sizes at maturity. It also looks at different milestones along the way then.
Okay. And I have to agree with Mr. Combs. I would not like to see a pie in the sky type of thing. Frankly, 40% is a heck of a lot from my perspective. Again, that would be a goal worth achieving, but I don't think it's achievable, my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buer.
I know that Brian Parsons have his hand up, but let me finish what I was going to say because it won't take much longer. On the other items, the city tree fund is easy. I think we've talked about that. That's just some minor text changes to the existing code. Another fairly easy one is the heritage and historic trees. That's a relatively minor amendment to the existing code, and that's being allowed on a voluntary basis by the property owner. On item number 3, industrially zoned property exemption, I think that we're going to have to move to the no exemption category. So that one's fairly easy. I also think that we're close on 8 and 9. So when we come back to the city planning commission, your next meeting, the areas that we'll be focusing on, if it's okay, would be the areas that I have not addressed, because that seems to be where the commission is having most of its concerns.
Okay, great. Mr. Parsons.
Yeah, I think I'll try to keep it short on the opinions. I mean, I think like we all said, incentives, the more we can do there and apply it to everything, I think from what I'm hearing in the council, we're pretty much all in agreement there. Mr. Buer, thanks for clarification on those. I think the areas you've talked about make a lot of sense. And if they're easy to do, that should be where we focus. I'd say from what I heard in this presentation, it seems like we have a problem with Gary Oaks, because if we're having a difference and it's causing lawsuits and the city's having to deal with it, we need some clarification that either we're on the same page with the state or we're trying to avoid that, because that seems like a waste of fees for everybody and time. And I would say in talking with folks, trying to get some opinions around the area around trees, really what I heard more was around Gary Oaks versus an overall canopy code based on the impact of the trees, the community, that they last 500 years and kind of the general beauty when you think about them. in the area. So I don't, like Mr. Combs had mentioned, I don't want to take a total scattershot approach, say 40%, when really it seemed like a lot of the public comments and people I was talking to were more concerned about protecting majorly the Gary Oaks. So I'll just throw that out there.
Thank you, Mr. Parsons. Mr. Wegeman.
Yeah, I'll be follow on from Mr. Combs. First off, I want to say that, you know, the work that you guys, Courtney and Alex, have done, appreciate all that and the people you've worked with to get to where we are. I think this is a good discussion. I know when we combined all the committees into the Planning Commission, we spent a lot of time talking about the Growth Management Act. And, you know, I have some frustrations with the Growth Management Act, but the one thing that I did learn after going through some of the training and sitting on the Planning Commission is the Growth Management Act is really a checklist to work with your community to decide what you want to do. And I think that goes back to what Mr. Combs was talking about, that we, you know, what are we trying to accomplish? You know, what is the goal? What is that target? You know, if it's just canopy cover, that may be one thing, but I think it's really more than that. And I'll just give you some frustrations of things that have happened in this community since I've been here. Two things that got me involved politically in this community was when they built this building that we're sitting in tonight. The recurring maintenance because of the open beams. You know, you may like this structure, you may like this design, or you may not. But the recurring maintenance is an issue, and it's expensive. Hipkins Road, when we did the traffic calming on Hipkins Road, and then we put all the little gardens along the side of the road, all of a sudden those get overgrown. Who takes care of them? And those become an issue, and then you have to make sure they get watered and all the other things. It certainly, in theory, looks good. You get it all put together, but then it gets overgrown. And then what do you do? Who's going to take care of it? So I come back to when we put this thing together, what is the recurring maintenance issues that we're going to have to deal with? You know, as you get more canopy cover, let's talk about stormwater drains. When they get full of leaves and our streets get flooded, what are we going to do then? And again, I don't want to come off as all negative on this thing because, as I said in our last meeting, I mean, who hates trees? Why would you hate a tree? You know, I mean, if you're a kid, you love trees. Why? Because you like to put rope swings in them, or you like to build tree houses in them, and you like to do those kind of things. If you like birds, you like to see trees. So all those things are wonderful. And if you're a little kid, and it comes time for Thanksgiving, you get a pine cone and you can make a little turkey model out of it at school. So there's all kinds of things that trees do for you that are really valuable to us as a community. But again, the recurring cost is an ouch. And when you started talking about the heritage trees, one of the things that I kept seeing, and I think of the last line of number 3 on that, was the maintenance. Who pays for that? If it's going to be on my property, you know, the problem is for those that get old trees in their yard, they're getting pretty old, and they're probably on fixed incomes, and so the cost of taking care of a tree, how does that get taken care of? And so anyhow, those are some of the thoughts that I'm seeing as we go through this, and I really appreciate the conversation and the comments of everybody here tonight, because we as a community have to think through this and figure out how the best to make it work. I do like the incentive program. I think the penalty or the fines, that's always a negative when you go to tell somebody they're going to get fined. And I can tell you, from me working within the city with the building, when I've had building permits and things, many times when you first start out to try to do a self-help project in your home, dealing with the inspectors is not very fun. But you know what? When they find out that you're trying to do it right and they work with you, then all of a sudden they become very helpful. And I can give you story after story where inspectors have come to me and said, you know, if you did it this way, it would be better, it would cost less, and everybody would be happy. And so when Mr. Bureau mentioned the education process. I think that needs to be really key is in everything that we put together here. Our citizens, our fellow citizens need to know the value that this is going to bring to our community, and it's going to be better for all of us as we do that. My last thing I'll close on that didn't get covered as well as I would like to see it done is when you showed a lot, we didn't really talk about property line. And if your neighbor has a tree just a foot over the property line, you know, how do we resolve some of those issues? So those are some things to think about. So anyhow, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wegeman. Any other comments? Mr. Buer, any closing of that?
I have a few.
Okay, Ms.
comments, Chair.
Burnell, go right ahead, Ms. Burnell.
So based off of the conversation, I have made a couple of adjustments to the matrix, which I can send out after this meeting. First off, I added 30% canopy and a fifth option even for our canopy goal of no net loss. And this is something that was suggested by Darren Masters, who's our area habitat biologist, that this is where he recommends all jurisdictions start, is looking at their overall canopy coverage and setting an initial goal of no net loss. So as we see development projects come through, we're looking to at least replace the canopy that's removed. And then we look at growth farther out. I also highlighted the areas that Dave had mentioned. It seemed like we were getting some general consensus on. And I added another option for residential lots exemption. We had the 10,000 gross square feet, but include Oregon white oaks as a set apart species that would require a permit. And I also added that 17,000, which is something that we have today, the 17,000 square foot lot exemption. Last thing I wanted to hit on was an item brought up by both Wegman and Mr. Combs regarding solar panel. We heard that concern and we did incorporate it into trimming to allow for trees to be trimmed so they could be removed under standard allocations, but if it was specific to a Gary oak, they would be able to be trimmed even to allow for solar panel use.
Great, that's great. And myself, I'll just have just a couple of comments as well, following on the tree canopy. You're right, I like that other option, no net loss. I'm not in favor of the 40%, probably closer to the 30, but this other option, no net loss, makes a lot of sense. I follow all the other fellow commissioners on number 7, and I mean number 7, 10, 11, and 12. Those are pretty easily, like Mr. Buer has mentioned. I do not agree with a lot of the fee structure. That's probably going to be our toughest thing to nail down on fee structure and penalties. So those are just my basic comments. I don't want to think that the ad hoc committee, Ms. Burnell, Alex, and Chris, in your efforts, that we totally abandoned every recommendation and things like that. I just hope you're not hearing that all the efforts were for naught. This is a great starting point, but I think after the public hearing on July 6th, I think some of these things are going to start to answer themselves from what our fellow citizens in Lakewood are feeling as well. And so I think we can hear those as well. Mr. Buer and staff is going to come back with Ms. Burnell with some consensus of what we talked about today for next week. And then maybe we can narrow it down a little bit. And then after the public hearing, I'm sure we're going to have a little bit of a difference of recommendations that might go to the council. So that's just my synopsis right now. Mr. Buer.
I was going to suggest that the council or the commission may wish to close its discussion on trees for tonight. We have no new business. We do have Council Member Boki in the audience. I'm not sure if he would like to provide any kind of update. Would be up to him.
Mr. Boki? Nothing? Okay, I appreciate it. I recommend that then we do close this discussion for tonight, and then we call this meeting adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Courtney, can I ask a question since the meeting is closed now? Courtney?
I'm still here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, you brought up the net loss.
Mhm.
So can you elaborate on that? I heard that also from that briefing that you gave when you walked around. So where are we at on net loss? What's it going to take to get there?
We're already there. We've actually seen a slight level of canopy growth. Alex and Chris, do you have that number available for where we're at today for our canopy coverage, citywide canopy coverage?
26%.
We're at 26%, and we've seen an increase in canopy coverage, even though our trees, even though we've had trees removed, obviously, for a variety of reasons. We've seen an increase in canopy coverage because the canopy itself grows over time as trees mature. So we have actually achieved already no net loss. And so it would be a matter of continuing to prioritize that, or maybe if we're looking for growth, setting a different goal for a higher percentage.
Okay, we're there. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you all.
Thank you.